I hope.
Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of Sunday, January 19th, 2025. Today, we are pleased to offer you a fascinating conversation about the anthropology of the transhumanist and cryonicist communities. Joining us today is our distinguished panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers and members, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg, our member from Texas who heads the Texas Transhumanist Party, Alan Crowley, and our foreign ambassador in Spain and technology advisor, Dr. Jose Cordero. So welcome to our panelists. And our special guest today is Dr. William Dawley. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bergen in Norway, working on the Human Futures Project with a focus on technoscientific immortality. And this is quite a fascinating project. You can find out more about it from its webpage, which I have displayed here. Dr. Dawley's role is to research cryonics in the United States and to better understand the transhumanists associated with it, especially their view of humanity's place in history and the future. He brings to the project his research interests in processes of sociocultural change and political economic change and the role of technology in these changes, especially biomedicine and new social organizational technologies, and in how these changes interact with constructions of family and gender, and in a multidisciplinary historical approach to the study of religion, spirituality, and secularism. And I will also say that William delivered an excellent presentation at the Global Cryonics Summit in Miami in July of 2024, and I was quite intrigued by what he had to say there. You can find the video recording of that presentation on the Cryosphere channel. It's also linked in the description of this video stream. But for now, I will open up the floor to William for his introductory remarks. Welcome, William, and please proceed.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone for having me here. I also apologize in advance. We've caught a round of illness here in my house, and I will do my best to not show that. But yes, I've been working on this project for 3 years now. I'm a social anthropologist that was trained at the University of California in San Diego. And this project is based out of the University of Bergen in Norway, as well as
it seems that we
tries to look at different ways that people have imagined through technoscience, which is a technical term, various forms of science, be they digital or biological, by which people are trying to extend lives, potentially forever, but at least beyond contemporary limitations. This is interesting for a lot of reasons to people in because of their interests in this matter. Personally, I'm the only American on the project, I think, other than Anya Bernstein, who's naturalized to the US. And My part of the project, as you can see here in this case studies section, basically focuses on the biological aspect. People that want to, at least in the shorter term, extend their biological life. And I'm focusing mainly on cryonics and anti-aging. Although I have plans to expand this project in the future and look at some other angles of this. Other members of the project have focused on, what is commonly known as mind upload and other forms of digital immortality. I don't mean to use the term immortality really loosely. I know that it's somewhat contested, and actually one of the papers that I've written that will be put out in the first issue of a 2025 journal out of Germany called Curare, which is the Latin for to cure, is essentially about this shift that I'm calling Cryonics 2.0, which isn't perhaps a total qualitative shift, but does represent some changes in what I've perceived in reading about the history of cryonics and the way that it was conceived in its earlier years and the sorts of demographics and cultural interests that people had during the earlier, let's say, half or portion of cryonics, and what has happened or seems to have been happening more recently in terms of cryonics and many aspects of transhumanism becoming somewhat more mainstreamed. And I guess that's my interest, because the reason I think this project got funded and the reason a lot of people are interested in this is because I'm sure many of you know this, and I don't have to tell anyone here. This has gone from being a somewhat more niche interest with a somewhat smaller subculture or demographic that's interested in it to a much broader phenomenon, not only in terms of people that are interested, but as you all know, in terms of the places where these things are being practiced. The number of cryonics institutes or providers in the world have expanded really in the past 5 years pretty dramatically. And this is also true in the realm of anti-aging, which I've been to the A4M conferences, the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine, a couple times, and they have also at these conferences marveled at the way that that their interest in anti-aging has become sort of mainstream and how they're grappling with that. So these are some of the interests that I have, and I've written a few articles for this project, and I'm in the process of writing a book. The articles that I've written basically in order. The first one is called Triangulating Transhumanism, and that came out in a collected volume by Bergen Books. And the subtitle there is How Risk, Race, and Religion in U.S. Culture Produce Futures and Afro-Futures. And I know that sounds a little aside from the point, but the point of that article was to try to triangulate or locate transhumanism and its contemporary forms, in terms of the way it's talked about by people who identify as transhumanists, and also in terms of the discourse around other futurisms, see transhumanism, dialogue with it, and I specifically in that article focus on Afrofuturism, but I'm also interested in phenomena that many of you are interested in, solar punk, other sort of futurisms that have come in and out of fashion. So that's the first article that I wrote for this. The second article that I've just briefly alluded to is Cryonics 2.0. And the subtitle of that article sort of lets you know a bit about it. It's From Immortalism to Indefinite Lifespan. And I'm sort of tracing a number of differences that I've noticed in the way that people are framing transhumanism amongst chronicists. When I've attended cryonics, not just summits, but workshops, when I've gone to cryonics organizations and interviewed chronicists. And that's the research that I presented at the Global Cryonics Summit in Miami. There are a number of interesting changes, and I really here should thank Max Marty, who is the host of a well-known Cryonics podcast and also plays so many roles in that community. He hosts the Discord servers, the summit that we just spoke about, a number of groups and institutions that he's involved in, and he also did a great survey of contemporary chronicists that had many respondents compared to prior surveys, and I was able to compare that with some data from James Hughes, who was once the president of Humanity Plus, formerly the World Transhumanist Association, right? WTA. So I got to look at some of that data and just try to understand some of the differences in how people identify, for instance, as transhumanists or other kinds of futurists, longevity enthusiasts, this sort of thing. Currently, I'm finishing an article about cryonics, anti-aging, and the family that tries to take a little bit different look at cryonics than the way that it's typically portrayed in the media, and also anti-aging. Sometimes, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the sort of sensationalistic, sort of journalistic approach to these topics is not maybe very helpful for people that are interested in them seriously. And so in this article, which has a sort of a punny name, it's "Are We Just Kidding Ourselves?" Kidding with two N's as opposed to TDs. And that's with a question mark. And the implication there is that we're not, that the interest in chronics and anti-aging actually embraces a lot, for many people, a lot of interests in the family and in extending and enriching kinship. And I got to interview a lot of people about their ideas about how chronics fits in with their own families, with the ideas of the family, with the human family, etc. And so that's, I think, and in the future, I'm writing a grant right now that tries to look at the overlap between disability as a topic of study and topic of medical science and transhumanism, because in my time in these circles, I have noticed that many transhumanists, many people that are interested in anti-aging and chronics, see the relationship and link between the technologies and advances that they're promoting and disability. Very often, many of these scientific endeavors or biomedical treatments or technologies are often tried first with people that have disabilities or poor health prognosis. And I'm interested in better understanding that overlap. So that's the current project that I'm trying to expand this into, which will look at chronics and anti-aging, as well as brain-computer interfaces and sort of other more digital technologies that initially are being used with people who have disabilities, but have many transhumanist applications. And so that's my goal in the future. And I guess that's most of the research that I've done so far, and I'm happy to talk about it in a little more depth while leaving room for questions and making sure I'm not missing anything major.
Yes, thank you very much, William, for these introductory remarks. And I will note that those who would like to look at the case studies that you prepared for the Human Futures Project may navigate to the link below. This was also the website that we had displayed during your introductory remarks. My first question pertains to this forthcoming article that you discussed, the article on cryonics, anti-aging, and the family. And I think this one is of particular interest to people in the transhumanist and cryonicist communities, because quite often there arise situations when family members might not see eye to eye, especially in regard to how or whether a person's wishes about what might happen to them after legal death would be fulfilled. And I do wonder if your article delves into that and how these dynamics might vary as well, because I can envision circumstances where some people who want to make certain provisions for themselves would have the support of their family members, but other people might not encounter even an understanding of that. And we've seen that in the history of cryonics as well, where, for instance, there have been legal battles, say, most famously with the family of Ted Williams. That was a high profile case where Ted Williams wanted to have his, let's say, his body cryopreserved, and some of his family members differed from that. So do you delve into that in your article on cryonics, anti-aging, and the family?
Definitely. And actually, to be honest, I struggled with how much of that to include. In some ways, I think that part of the story is a little better covered. But one of the last comments that I received from a reviewer basically suggested that I also include this to, add to the nuance of the picture. I've also attended some of the OSLAP seminars, which is an acronym that has to do with legal asset preservation. People that wish to preserve that either to both to be cryopreserved and also to set aside some number of their assets, both for the cryopreservation itself and in the hopes of future revival or recreation. And so I think that is, I think, maybe the central tension, what you've identified, which is on the one hand, many family members historically have not been supportive. They have fought against people's plans for cryopreservation. And I think this has been maybe a little bit better understood than the other phenomenon, which is where people like the former CEO of Alcor have their entire family signed up, more or less, or most of their family signed up. So I think those are really the two sides of it. On the one hand, you have the fact that many people are not supportive of their family members or former family members pursuing this. And in fact, the cryonics community in some ways has talked amongst itself and even mildly complained that there isn't more of a family orientation around these things. And I think that was, for instance, one of the things that people sought to underline with the role of Patrick Harris and people like him that tried to bring, let's say, a more family-friendly or familial face to cryonics. On the other hand, one of the things I try to deal with in the article is the way that, in fact, for many people, the future that they imagine for themselves, they very much want their family members, or at least as many of them as would wish, to be a part of it. And so I was sort of not surprised, but when I encountered these interviews and I elicited more interviews about this topic, I realized that this has not been as well covered. For some reason, the depiction of cryonics and anti-aging has been, in its more negative moments, seen as entirely egotistical, and even in its more neutral moments, seen as at least individualistic, as mostly individuals seeking this for themselves. And I just don't feel like there's enough depiction in the academic or journalistic record of cryonics of people that want this for themselves and their loved ones, including family and chosen family. At the Alcor board meeting in Chicago, where they moved the body of the Norwegian grandfather who was brought over and sort of self-stored by his grandson for a period of time, and then restored in a doer provided by Alcor to a very famous hotel very high in the Colorado mountains. This was one example of it, but I heard at that summit many elicited remarks and many interviews that I conducted briefly afterwards, where people talked about how important it was for both them and their spouse to be signed up, and the sort of pain and struggle of either having their children reject their plans and hoping that they would come around, or struggling to get their parents, or grandparents, or elderly community members signed up against the sort of seeming hill of the costs and other sort of practices that are involved to get people fully signed up. So those are, I think, are the two sides of it. And I'm glad you raised this, because of course it's not just a one-sided thing where everyone in cryonics, in fact, has their whole family signed up. But it is the case, I think, that it's a bit of a mixed picture between people that struggle against family members, either opposing their own plans or opposing plans to include them in cryopreservation, or on the other hand, desperately wanting those people to be involved and in some cases succeeding.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that response. And my impression has been, indeed, that almost all cryonicists would be thrilled if their family members were to support them and to make similar plans for themselves. So it's not a situation where they would only seek to make these arrangements for themselves, no matter what other people might want, especially people close to them. But of course, a lot of cryonicists will also respect the wishes of their family members who think differently and prefer something different, because a lot of cryonicists do respect individual autonomy. Now, I think a sentiment I often hear is they would have wished for that same respect to be applied to them and their wishes. And this is indeed an uphill battle because cryonics is not a common practice, unlike, say, burial or cremation. But cremation, too, was not a common practice until about the mid 20th century. So something happened, a cultural shift happened, whereby that became a more culturally accepted option. And I suspect the cost has a lot to do with that, by the way. And if cryonics were able to bring the cost of its services down to levels comparable to what a cremation would cost, I think it might meet with greater popularity. But I do think that this is an area well worth exploring, in particular, how family members, especially in cases where their relative who wishes to be cryopreserved has the means to do that, could be more effectively persuaded to allow that to happen. Because in the more high profile cases, it wasn't a matter of affording it, it was just a matter of the family members ultimately being willing or not willing to carry out the wishes of the person who had legally died.
Indeed. Indeed.
Yes. So we have a question from Alan Crowley, and he wants to ask about this identity space between people who consider themselves as transhumanists and the ideas of the people who dislike the transhumanist label. And the disliked transhumanists, as Alan characterizes them, may be a group that does not identify as transhumanists. So perhaps, and Alan, you may want to clarify this, there is a group of people whom I would call implicit transhumanists who don't like to use that label because they think that label might meet with opposition or hostility, or they need to go through explanations that they would prefer to avoid and maybe just focus on, let's say, the practical benefits of certain technologies or advocating for greater health or greater quality of life. Some longevity advocates would not use the term transhumanist to refer to themselves, even though I would say they are implicitly by virtue of advocating longer and healthier human lifespans. So, what are your thoughts about this tension? Because your research does focus on this, and you've even identified a trend whereby some of the younger members of our community are actually less hesitant about using the label transhumanist and being more open about these ideas.
And sure, I apologize for not having shared this correctly initially, but I sent a little link in the chat that is the presentation that I gave at that Cryonics seminar. And if you want to open that up, I could sort of talk over some of the slides that show this graphically, and maybe it'll be a little clearer. I don't know if that's possible.
Yes, let me see what I can do here in that regard,
Well, let me
because
clarify my
I
question, if I may,
do.
while you're doing that.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I know that when I worked in various operations in Iraq, some were about psychological, kind of winning the hearts and minds, or persuading people to do things, and a lot of that went. A lot of the research in that was about how people identify, right? So does somebody identify themselves as a citizen of Iraq first, and then secondly by their religion, Shia, Sunni, Christian, etc., or are they, educated or aristocracy first, and then citizen next? Um, and I think there's a lot of the sort of World Economic Forum, which is not necessarily about longevity or beneficial integration of technology. It's really more about just getting everybody on the same sheet of music under the same sheet of oligarchs, larger. But those people are disliked and called transhumanist, even though, I mean, they don't consider themselves transhumanist, and I think most transhumanists would not consider themselves or consider those people transhumanist. But again, everybody's different. So yeah, you've got your slides up. Please feel free to answer.
Oh no, I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. The term transhumanism is slippery for a number of reasons. One of them has to do, as I talk about in this paper, with the sort of baggage that it has accumulated, and the trend that Gennady was referring to, where the result of this has been that older generations of chronicists have, in some cases, at least in public, artfully dropped the transhumanist label and the immortalism label even more strongly because of the idea that it has certain connotations that they no longer wish to emphasize. For them, the practice of technoscientific immortality, the practice of trying to extend their lives, is more important than the label. And I think there's a lot of room for debate about that, because there's also an argument, I guess, that people should have an ideology or a conceptual framework to guide these efforts. So the trend that I noticed, and if Gennady can sort of scale through these slides just a bit, basically that there are these two things. On the one hand, a shift from transhumanism becoming an explicit label that is used by a very specific set of organizations and people, to this broader effort where a lot of people agree with the goals of transhumanism without necessarily wanting to use the label. So there's something like an implicit transhumanism. And that's actually something that I took from one of Gennady's earlier podcasts. And I guess the other thing, of course, is the rise of rationalism and the associated movements as another on-road into transhumanism. People might argue that in some ways these trends have always been present, and that I'm just describing a slight shift in some ways. But in other ways, I think it's undeniable that, formally at least, these movements like rationalism, certain forms of effective altruism, and long-termism have certainly become the ways that people have started to know about transhumanism. And I think there's maybe a third thing that I should mention, and that is the fact that as transhumanism, the concept, has been popularized, most of what you find online about transhumanism is not by transhumanists. It's about people who are critics or even misidentifying probably what most of you would think of as transhumanism. It's used as a way to describe a certain kind of techno-dystopia, right? And that's the first paper that I sort of wrote, was noticing that when I did hashtag searches or image searches about transhumanism on Instagram and other social media sites, most of what comes up is highly dystopian, and that's not, I think, what most transhumanists would like to be associated with. And exactly the sorts of things you're mentioning, sort of conspiratorial ideas about the World Economic Forum, about the COVID vaccine. For instance, when I was doing this search, a lot of the hashtag transhumanism posts were essentially about this. And it's created a sense of baggage. Now, I'm not sure if that's exactly the sort of images and trend that older transhumanists are reacting against, or if they are just seeking to prioritize their instrumental goals. But one of the things I noticed, and if you scale down just a little bit more, is that in answer to this question, whether I consider myself a transhumanist or other things, there is, if you add together rationalist and rationalist adjacent, there's too much overlap with effective altruists here to be too useful. But it's about, it's about 51%, right? Which is slightly higher in some ways if you take these as separate groups, and they mostly are people either chose rationalist or rationalist adjacent. It's equal to slightly higher, maybe in a non-statistically significant sense, slightly higher than the transhumanist label itself. And that when I further analyze this data to try to understand, on the next slide, I'll show some of these correlations between different terms, rationalist, effective altruist. One of the things that I discovered was that there's a strong negative correlation between transhumanism and like a 0.000, like statistical significance or probability of being owed to chance between transhumanism as a chosen label and age, which suggests pretty strongly that what Gennady was saying is the case, that younger respondents to the survey, at least, were much more likely to identify with transhumanism. And then if you go down a little bit further at the next slide, what you actually find is that when I further broke down this data and I coded it in 4 or 5 different ways to try to understand what other factors besides age were playing a role, it does appear that people in the US both make up an older cohort of transhumanists and chronicists in particular as a whole, and that people that came from English-speaking countries where English was the dominant language, more than being a former Western colony or any number of different ways of coding this. Basically, it was a linguistic thing, that if English was the major language, maybe the baggage about transhumanism in those circumstances was greater, because the younger and the more non-English speaking a respondent was, the more likely they were to use the term transhumanism. And this is something that James Hughes and other people that have a social science background and have been involved with transhumanism have often noted, that the flavor of French transhumanism, for instance, or Spanish movements, for instance, is very different in some ways from the US or the Anglo flavor of this. And perhaps also doesn't have the same baggage, let's say. So if people are making this decision a little bit instrumentally and saying, hey, look, I don't want the label to get in the way of my goals, right. The label may be more important in English, let's say, or in certain communities. So that's what I'm noticing. So I think you're absolutely right. To answer your question more directly, I think that you can't take for granted that the label transhumanism has to do with the content of transhumanism at all. But there are certain trends there. And if you go, and I guess the next one that I'll talk to at some point is the rationalist thing. But I think that maybe answers your question in the most succinct way I'm capable.
Yeah, I would just like to say I noticed that Jose's probably got a question or comment or two on this, being from Spain. But yeah, he brought on some slides of their pro-transhumanism march where they had hundreds of people and signs and just it's hard to imagine that happening in the U.S. where people mainly march about something they're mad about, right? If they march at all. So yeah, I'll thanks for answering. Thank you, appreciate that.
Yes, thank you. And now we have a question from Jose.
Yes, hello. This is a very interesting discussion. And I am just looking at the website of the University of Bergen. And I had 2 questions. One about other case studies covering different areas of transhumanism, if you can mention just that briefly. And also, I am surprised that there is an advisory board with 2 very prominent people in the biological side of immortality, like Vadim Gladyshev and also Leon Peshkin. So did you get those in, or how did they come out in the advisory board?
It's a great question. One of the great things about working in Norway and at Norwegian institutions is not just the the abundance of state funding that comes from their sovereign wealth fund and that provides a lot of academic funding for different research. But they also have a very different academic culture. And one of the things that they strongly encourage in these grants is to form an advisory board of 4 to 10 experts who can advise you on things about which you're not an expert. And it's really great that we were able, in many cases, to get some of these people involved. I think this is partly due to the efforts of Anya Bernstein at Harvard, who's written a book called The Future of Immortality that came out in 2019. And she was very involved also with a lot of anti-aging scientists of Russian origin, many of whom are in the US and other places now. But yeah, that's, I think, really the benefit of working with this project and in this university context, is that we've managed to get the advice and guidance of a lot of different people from different disciplines. And it's also something I've tried to do in this project by attending, many of these A4M conferences that I mentioned. That's the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine, the RADFest conferences I've seen many of you at, and just trying to understand and get to know the scientists and the science behind some of these efforts a little bit better. But no, thank you for noticing that. I think that's one of the strengths of the project, is that it has advice from people who are not just social scientists.
And how about the other case studies relating different points of view about transhumanism? And finally, since you like to go to conferences, you have to come to the one in Spain, to the International Longevity Summit in Madrid, which coincides with International Longevity Day, October 1st. So that week of October 1st, welcome to Madrid for a different perspective on immortality.
Oh, thank you. I really look forward to coming to that. I would like to. I'm sorry I haven't made plans yet, but I look forward. The other case studies, I guess I could speak a little bit, for instance, to Fartine Nilsson and Annalyn Eriksson, who is the PI, the principal investigator for this project. They've focused mostly on the digital side of this, people that are interested in creating what people used to, or many people still call mind files, people that are interested in whole brain emulation. I've gotten to meet some of these people, and I will say that this is not, there's a lot of overlap between this and cryonics and anti-aging. There's no real necessary contradiction. For many people, they are interested and invested in both. So while we divided up our labor in trying to understand these a little bit separately, just for the sake of convenience and attending the right events and getting to know the right people, eventually we came to the conclusion that these are highly overlapping phenomena. In many ways, Max Marty's survey, the Cryonics survey of 2022, I think is what he's calling it, shows that many people are in various ways open to non-biological revival. And again, these are not exclusive, because many people who think or plan or hope for a biological revival are not necessarily ruling out a digital revival as well. They have different ideas about the pace of change. Some people think one will come before the other. But many people who are cryonicists and anti-aging enthusiasts basically have a I don't want to say a grab bag approach, but they have a better safe than sorry approach. They want to take advantage of all the different options as much as they can and as much as they can afford to. And for many of them, cryonics is one way that they hope to reach that digital future. On the other hand, that's not everybody. There are many people in the cryonics world, maybe slightly more than half, who are a little bit more hopeful about the biological aspect. That doesn't mean they don't hope for digital enhancements. It just means that for them, they are more skeptical of whole brain emulation and those kinds of ideas, and they would be more open to an idea of, nano repair and incorporating nanotechnology into the biological body, and incorporating other forms of technology into our wetware, into our human bodies in this way. So it's really quite divided, and that was one of the really interesting things about the survey data that Max had, and that I was fortunate to have access to, is to show this diversity, which sometimes does not get portrayed in the media. But I think, again, the digital futures is a big part of it, and I wish I wish I understood it as well as my colleagues sometimes. I've gotten to understand it through these circles, but I just want to emphasize there that there's not really a strict contrast between people that imagine a digital or a biological future. For many people, these are things that will come together eventually, that will converge, as sometimes people talk about it. And for many chronicists and anti-aging enthusiasts, they are simply focusing on what they think is the more likely, first step towards that technoscientific immortality.
Yes, thank you very much for that response. And indeed, this is a common question and reason for discussions and debates within the transhumanist community, essentially, which form of immortality or radical life extension would one wish to pursue or would one prefer? I myself am firmly a proponent of the biological approach to the extent that it's attainable, and I don't rule out artificial parts, for instance, but I do think that a mind upload in at least the vast majority of circumstances, unless it's done very gradually, would create a copy and would not preserve the original individual. And we have a comment to this effect by one of our viewers, Jay Paul, who writes, "Consciousness is not technology, nor can it become or be extended or created by technology. Bionic limb, great. Downloading my personality into a donor body, it's not going to be you. You can take every bit of my data and transfer it in whatever way you'd like, but it will never be me." And I think what he's referring to in terms of the intuition behind his comment is the concept that I would term I-ness, that is the individual's unique vantage point upon the world. And that's not dependent on the content of our minds. It's dependent on essentially whether we see the world as ourselves and the continuity of our experience, or whether somebody else perceives that. So I'm not going to have your vantage point, even if I learn a lot about you and your life story and your life experiences, and I come to agree with every one of your perspectives and your opinions. I'm still going to be a distinct individual. And I think that's where some of the concern is about the mind uploading or whole brain emulation kinds of approaches, but it is an ongoing discussion. Now, we also have a comment from Alan, and thank you very much for your quite generous support. Alan says he finds the various ways that different people think about how humans use technology to be fascinating. And Alan also has another question in regard to passing on the vision behind transhumanism through fiction. Would that be helpful for showing popular interest and getting funding? And certainly that has been tried to some extent, even going as far back as Robert Ettinger, who in many ways is the originator of cryonics in the United States, at least. And he wrote a lot of short stories. You can find a short story of his from 1948 called The Penultimate Trump. And it's not referring to the Trump we know of, but it is a story about cryonics and essentially a wealthy entrepreneur who pursues cryopreservation and gets resurrected in a distant future. So this is an approach that has been tried. It has been a relatively under-resourced approach compared to all of the dystopian science fiction out there and the multi-million-dollar Hollywood productions that tend to portray a dystopian future because it's easier to do that, to create conflict and tension. But I definitely think there should be more attempts at transhumanist fiction. What do you think about this, Will?
I think this is a great question. In many ways, I think that the struggle that I hear transhumanists describe in getting their ideas, or let's say the implications of their ideas, more broadly accepted, is a result of, let's say, fiction or movie, art. In some ways, this is what my first article tried to deal with. Of course, I looked at it mostly through social media, but I think in some ways what social media reflects in this way is broader concerns and people's own takes on popular art and culture. And I do think in many ways this is maybe a problem of utopian and dystopian fiction about the future. In many ways, most utopian novels or forms of fiction are actually sort of not entirely optimistic, if that makes sense. We tend to think, oh, well, a dystopia novel is pessimistic, therefore, perhaps a utopian one isn't. But in fact, many utopian novels have been subtle warnings about the present and projections about what might not be able to come to pass if we carry on this path, or something that looks like utopia, but then when you start to dig under the surface is actually fairly unpleasant. So I do think that, fiction and science fiction in many ways play the biggest role in shaping popular ideas about the future. I don't think it's the only thing. And I think in many ways, some of the popularity of transhumanism or transhumanist goals and practices, like anti-aging medicine, for instance, have come from not from science fiction, but from real world scientific advances. So fiction is not the only way that people gain their ideas about the future. And it's maybe not the only way that people come to transhumanism, cryonics, or anti-aging. But I think it is for many people. In the survey that Max gave, one of the really interesting questions that he asked that I used later to identify the second thing, what I'm calling the rise of rationalism, is that for people that didn't come to transhumanism or cryonics or anti-aging through these rationalist sites, many of them cited science fiction as some of their earliest encounters. So the question specifically was, when and where did you first learn about real world cryonics? And even though the question is about real world cryonics, they sort of are given the option to enter something into a box, and they say, oh, well, actually, I heard about it first through science fiction, and then I started looking and hearing for it in other venues, and I discovered that it was something people were really doing. So I think it's true in both senses. Number one, in terms of how you get people signed up for cryonics or involved in anti-aging, it is true that many people come to this through fiction. And I also don't want to discount video games, right? It's not my particular strength here, gaming, but I think that when we talk about art and popular culture, we can't underestimate the role of that either, especially for people that are into this sort of thing. I think, for instance, the major cryonics server and place where people discuss these things that I know of is a Discord server. And of course, Discord initially was a gaming venue and remains predominantly a venue for gamers. So I think it's not an accident that was the venue. And in fact, they had to sort of guide many of their older members onto Discord and show them how it worked, because for the younger members, they could take it for granted. They were part of these worlds also. So yeah, as long as we in broaden fiction to understand that it also includes gaming and those sorts of things, and popular culture that you see on social media, absolutely. It seems to be, as a factual matter, the way that a lot of people come to this, and also the way that a lot of people's ideas about the future are shaped.
Absolutely. Well, I was really kind of making that question in response to your comment about getting more study into the academic journals. And I think you've got to reach a student who wants to do the research first. And that's kind of why I was thinking, science fiction or writing or newspaper articles. You mentioned games and Discord servers, other web pages, et cetera. So I think that's really important. But yeah, I think ultimately the point is to not just get it into the journals, but get individuals working on it scientifically so they can put it in the journals. But that reaches a smaller percentage of the population than, say, Star Trek and the flip phone.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, indeed. And You're correct in your observation about games having an impact. We've had several people on our virtual Enlightenment salons, including our current vice chairman, Arin Vahanian, who were quite strongly inspired by the game Deus Ex Human Revolution. And this is a game that I played myself, though I had been a transhumanist explicitly for about a decade when I played it, and implicitly for much of my life. But there are a lot of other games that are implicitly transhumanist, any games that involve some element of space exploration or action in space where one can see a civilization that's greatly advanced compared to our own. A game that has a very detailed universe like that is Mass Effect, the Mass Effect series. And even some of the earliest computer games gave people a certain frame of mind that I would consider broadly transhumanist. If you think of the Civilization series, for instance, I played the original Civilization game and really the subsequent ones through Civilization 6. And the idea that you are essentially overseeing the development of an entire society from the hunter-gatherer era to the space age. And there are some civilization scenarios or extensions that allow one to go beyond the contemporary level of technology. That does shatter some of the status quo bias that a lot of people are prone to, because people can see within the course of a few hours how technology in particular can radically change a society, and their frame of mind becomes one of, well, this kind of change is possible, not one of, well, the present is pretty much like the past and the future is going to be pretty much like the present, which I see an astonishing number of people still thinking, despite all of the radical transformations that have happened during the course of our lifetimes. And Alan also points out Cyberpunk 2077. So that's another game. And there are many more. There are many more. So Luis Arroyo wonders, does propaganda in any sense have a place with creating an interest in cryonics? So I do wonder what Luis would characterize as propaganda, but it could be something as innocuous as, let's say, really compelling art or memes. It doesn't have to be nefarious. It would just be effective in that way of grabbing people's attention. So what do you think of that question?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because it sort of follows on the last question. In many ways, art is some of the most effective propaganda in the classic political sense that we mean in terms of 20th century propaganda. You know, it's not all just when you think of like Soviet or Chinese propaganda that we normally in America think of as like propaganda, you know, in quotes. You know, sure, it was art sometimes of guys with burly forearms, you know, like showing the strength of the proletariat in this way. But there was also a lot of what we call social realism. And of course, now we sort of poo-poo that. But I think there's many contemporary authors who are reevaluating its effect. In terms of popular American writers, Thomas Frank, the popular historian of U.S. culture who works for The Guardian and writes pieces occasionally, has written about this social realism. In his recent book, The People Know, which is a history of anti-populism in the U.S. Propaganda incorporates reality. Another way that we might think about propaganda, of course, has to do with kinds of transhumanism that we may or may not feel inclined towards. One of the things that I noticed in this study that I used to write Cryonics 2.0 is in this rise of rationalism. Many people might consider certain aspects of rationalism and effective altruism and long-termism to be a sort of intentional kind of propaganda, in the sense of propagating ideas through institutional networks, through people getting together and working on similar projects. I'm a member of the 80,000 Hours listserv, for instance, which is an effective altruist network that tries to give people jobs and where they feel like their impact on the future can be the greatest. This might also be, I think, seen as propaganda. Also, I think we can't underestimate the power of documentaries. People might not think of documentaries as being that popular, but compared to many forms of art, they're quite popular. They may not be as widely, they may be just as popular as video games, if more diffuse in their effects. I recently watched the Brian Johnson Netflix documentary. I've seen on Netflix Hope Frozen, which is about the 2-year-old girl from Thailand whose family cryo. Hi, did we have a brief interruption?
Yes, we did. You last mentioned the documentary Hope Frozen, which I did see a few years ago. It actually featured Robert McIntyre, one of the scientists who is working on the aldehyde stabilized cryopreservation approach, whom we had on one of our virtual Enlightenment salons in 2020. But please continue from that point.
Oh, no problem. So I think these sorts of efforts do definitely play a role. I mean, a lot of people in the anti-aging community or chronics community have mixed feelings about a character like Brian Johnson and his role. But if you take the broadest sense of propaganda, which is to simply propagate these ideas without too much concern for sectarian divides about different approaches to transhumanism, I think it's undeniable that these have a lot of reach. And I think especially the Hope Frozen documentary really managed to engage people very initially with a sense of sympathy for chronics that perhaps before I don't know another example of somebody portraying chronics so emotionally compellingly. A lot of people that are opposed to transhumanism and life extension sort of have this perspective that some transhumanists call deathist, where they say you've essentially lived a long, full human life. Why push for more? But I think in the case of Hope Frozen and this girl, very few people would argue that 2.5 years suffering with a terminal illness is a full human life, and it sort of got around that objection in a very compelling way. I think, even if people didn't come out of it, signing up for chronics. So yeah, I hope that just wraps up the answer in some ways to say that there's a lot of different things that we might think of as propaganda, and likewise about the Brian Johnson documentary. I'll just mention one last thing there, which is that that's another example of a place where the role of family ends up being a huge part of the documentary, and I was grateful for that, and I'm using it a bit in this article because most people's impression of this person doesn't really correct some of the misconceptions about transhumanism, because he's a tech billionaire. He's spending over $2 million a year. The way it's talked about in journalism is sort of sensational and emphasizing maybe in some ways how out of reach this is, even though his program is to try to make it more accessible in some ways. But in the documentary, similarly, you see a focus on his relationship with his son and the importance of family. And yeah, I think those sorts of things, when you think about effective propaganda, if the goal is to convert people to transhumanism, I do think this aspect of the family is key, because many people have the misconception that transhumanism is about replacing, let's say, traditional human immortality, which is like through reproduction, the family and creating the next generation with a sort of individualized immortality. But these two things are not really mutually exclusive. And so I think effective propaganda always starts from people's existing assumptions and seeks to broaden them rather than hitting them immediately with you have to change everything you think, you know.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that response. And Luis Arroyo writes on Brian Johnson that love him or hate him, he is good at getting people to think of anti-aging possibilities. And indeed, he has amassed quite a following online, and the recent Don't Die documentary has definitely helped with that. In terms of what he's trying to achieve, indeed, he states that his goal is to make life extension regimens, let's say, more accessible to people. And he emphasizes that to get about 80% of the benefit that he is reporting, people do not have to spend $2 million a year. They can spend a much more modest sum that is within the means of most. So I think he is trying to intentionally court controversy in order to get noticed. And based on what I have heard about his attitude, he essentially thinks that if about 50% of your listeners do not absolutely hate you, then you're not being radical enough or ambitious enough with the way in which you present yourself. Now, clearly, here at the Virtual Enlightenment Salon, we have taken a different approach, and we hope that maybe only about 1% of our viewers will hate us. And that's not because we're trying to make them hate us, it's because that seems to be a statistical inevitability when one is engaged in any sort of public activity. But nonetheless, we see the benefit of somebody trying to bring greater visibility to the cause, as long as they don't do absolutely horrible things in the service of that. But I don't think Brian Johnson is doing anything nefarious. I think his intentions are definitely in the right place. And yes, he does attract attention through some of what are frankly stunts, like the whole parabiosis blood exchange with his son. I think that's fairly extraneous to life extension, and he tried that once and he's not going to do it again. But that's one act that he is perhaps best known for, even though what he's really emphasizing is sleep and good nutrition. So it's interesting how the media attention focuses on the sensational, and he's really going after lifestyle basics. And Mike Lazine writes, Amen, Gennady. Thank you very much, Mike. And we have so many interesting comments right now from our audience. This has sparked a great conversation. Alan writes to Luis, that was like a master class in a nutshell on propaganda. Thanks for the question. And thank you, Will, for the answer. And John H. writes, whether things are different or the same regarding the present versus the future depends upon what one considers significant, fundamental, or essential change. Some may think that horses versus cars would constitute an essential change. And certainly in the late 19th and early 20th century, many people thought that way. Others do not. And of course, a lot of people have gotten used to automobiles as an essential part of life. But for instance, the Amish have not. They are still holdouts in that respect. And they will ride their buggies because they think there's something fundamental about their way of life that they wish to preserve that automobiles take away from them, rightly or wrongly. But I would like your thoughts on this question. Do you think that perhaps some of the hesitancy of the general public to explicitly adopt the label of transhumanists stems from some sort of aversion to changing something that they consider essential, even though it may not be, just like, say, open heart surgery didn't really change their views of the world, and they've come to accept it over time. Or anesthesia, which was opposed by some people for religious reasons in the 19th century, ultimately became accepted. So do you think that there's some sort of perception that there's a boundary that's being crossed into some essential transformations of what it means to be human that previous technologies did not cross?
I mean, I guess the short answer is yes, definitely. I think, for better or worse, the trans and transhumanists implies that there is something about the human condition that will be transcended or moved beyond, even if transhumanists themselves would not necessarily agree that this is, fundamental to the self or to humanity. I'm not sure that I have a great answer to this question. But I definitely think that tension is at the heart of people's experience. If you checked out the first article that I wrote, Triangulating Transhumanism, one of the two things I identify, race and religion, basically have to do with two of the anxieties about the future that people are worried will be erased. One of them is this aspect of the future where something like cultural or ethnic or race is one way we think about this in America. These forms of difference are sort of blotted out, or they become less important. And there's a lot of even fairly positive science fiction which basically implies this. Like, I'm definitely not a Star Trek expert, and I do not want to sort of go beyond what I know here. But you do get the impression from even these more potentially optimistic visions of the future that while there are people of different ethnicities, it's not as if they have preserved strong cultural differences. They sort of wear the jumpsuit, and they exist. They may look different, but they're not necessarily. These forms of human difference have been overcome by bigger things. So I think there's a little bit of anxiety about the idea that the future might really be about erasing cultural diversity or variation, whether or not that's true. And I think this is one of the reasons why when you do an image search on something like Afrofuturism or indigenous futurisms, you don't see the same level of pessimism. I think on some level, this is just a sheer fact that a lot of people want to see themselves in the future. They want to see these forms of human difference persisting, and they dislike the idea that futurism is either an erasure of these differences, or that it is a sort of, techno-colonialism where some forms of human life are blotted out or conquered by others. And I think that is indeed part of the anxiety and the reason that other forms of futurism do not have this problem. Likewise, I think if you looked at something like solar punk, there is the idea that the optimism in it is the idea that technology does not conquer nature, it grows together with nature and forms a happy sort of coexistence with nature. And this is also perhaps part of the anxiety, the idea that at present, technology, with all of its benefits, seems to provide some danger or damage to the natural environment, and the fear of it has to do with the idea that this is a straight line that will continue, that technology will continue to erase aspects of nature. I think that's one thing. And the other thing I think that people may object to is this aspect that we call religion. Now, I, in a previous life and in previous research, was an anthropologist of religion, and I've spent a lot of time with religious communities. And I'm interested in the fact that transhumanism itself, even though many transhumanists are sort of adamantly self-identified secularists, that's not all transhumanism. I know a lot of Mormon transhumanists. There are other examples, I suppose, and there are maybe other religious systems that are more implicitly open to something like transhumanism because of what the content of religion is. And I'm very hesitant to use the word religion in this way because I think there's a lot of assumptions and baggage that the term has that really come from people's own religion or own cultural background. Like in our society, for instance, we tend to assume religion has to do with God or the afterlife, where in many cases that's simply not the case. That's not what religion per se is about. But I do think there is this anxiety about playing God that you see people express. And I likewise think that there are ways around this or to ease this tension. And frankly, I think one of the reasons that a person like Brian Johnson, on the one hand, he's he'll make sort of almost irreligious or anti-religious comments on Twitter, that as Gennady points out, are perhaps intended to be a little bit of a thorn to sort of wake people up and sharpen attention to his project. But I also think there's something to the fact that not only is Mormon transhumanism, let's say, one of the biggest religious transhumanisms that exists, it has to do with something about Mormon theology and its history that makes people that are raised in Mormonism open to this, let's say, civilization game type effect, where there are forms of Mormon theology that believe in theosis, which is the term from Orthodoxy about divinization of the human, about making people more godlike over time, or evolving people spiritually and technologically into more godlike forms. But also, there's a way where the minute I found out Brian Johnson was Mormon, it made a lot of sense, because there's something about Mormonism as a cultural and religious system that's very good at propaganda, at conversion, And Brian Johnson manages to be both provocative and unerringly friendly and nice seeming in a way that Mormons are very effective at being. And in fact, I would say it's one of the, perhaps, I don't want to go outside of what I know here, but it's perhaps one of the reasons that they're so effective in converting people. They have had one of the fastest growth rates of any religious movement in the world, certainly in the 20th and 21st century, partly owing to the fact that some of it is the content of the belief, and some of it is just self-presentation. And I think that even if Brian Johnson has, rejected aspects of his religious past, this is also a cultural thing. And we could perhaps learn from people like that who have come from backgrounds that specialize in propagating their ideas, and not just through words, but also through the way that they compose themselves and present themselves. So I think that this may have got a little bit off topic from what Gennady asked, but to come back to it, I think that there are a lot of reasons that people may fear transhumanism and or misunderstand it or have misconceptions about it that have to do with things like culture and ethnicity, that have to do with things like ideas about nature, and that have to do with things like ideas about religion and spirituality. But I don't think these are necessary tensions. And I think there's a lot of counterexamples that we can point to where transhumanism has adopted aspects of what we might call religion, or respect for cultural difference, or respect for nature and biology that work against this prejudice.
Yes, indeed. And of course, transhumanism is a big tent. So we do welcome people of a broad range of religious and other ideological backgrounds, and certainly cultural backgrounds, so that in reality, we do have a great diversity of thought within the transhumanist community, and we would seek a world where that kind of diversity is accepted and permitted to flourish. Now, Luis Arroyo writes, "A united world or humanity is a goal to some and a fear to others." And I think, just like, say, in the Star Trek United Federation of Planets, there is a certain degree of, let's say, common principles that are followed. On the other hand, there's a great diversity of cultures and even sentient species that are able to collaborate in a world of abundance and tolerance. Now, to your point that sometimes those visions do seem a bit homogenizing, Art Ramon suggests that might be Starfleet Academy conditioning. Like, we see these people who are serving aboard the starships or in space stations like Deep Space Nine, and they're all of a certain, let's say, military background where they do have certain protocols and norms that they follow, but perhaps if we saw the broader society or societies of the Federation, we would observe a bit more difference. But it's a very valid question, because we do want certain aspects to extend to all of humanity or all sentient life forms. Our Transhumanist Bill of Rights, version 3.0, discusses sentient entities and the rights that they should have. But within those rights, there is presupposed to be a great deal of room for differences, both in terms of individual choice as well as cultural norms that people may choose to adopt or reject. And of course, those would include manner of dress, food choices, choices of whom one worships or doesn't worship, and lifestyle choices as long as they don't harm others. So all of what's encompassed within a broadly humanistic worldview is also encompassed within transhumanism and expanded upon. I think there is a concern among people of more conservative persuasions, broadly speaking, that a more cosmopolitan vision might erase their ability to live in a more homogeneous culture by choice. So if they want to live in a society where everybody follows certain norms or does certain things or observes certain traditions, they worry that a more cosmopolitan, or they would sometimes call it a more globalist culture, erases those differences. My response is it shouldn't. And transhumanists don't want to erase those differences, in the sense that we're not going to tell the Amish to stop following their particular traditions or force them to embrace technologies that they don't want to embrace. And we think that future technologies are also a matter of choice for individuals. And if they want to live in communities where those technologies are not utilized, they should have the right to do that. I do think sometimes it's a bit of an effort to communicate this. I've gone on certain, let's say, right-leaning talk shows where I ended up being on very good terms with the host afterward. Now, I don't think I could ever manage this with someone like Alex Jones, but I did manage this with Clyde Lewis, for instance, who tends to be quite a bit more reasonable in my view. But he had this view of transhumanism as essentially associated with this globalist World Economic Forum type of outlook. And I made some very clear distinctions. First of all, I don't really think the World Economic Forum necessarily holds the kinds of views that are ascribed to it on various alt-right programs. But nonetheless, that's also not quite the transhumanist perspective. And I made the necessary distinctions that led Clyde Lewis to actually be quite sympathetic to the transhumanist outlook at the end of that conversation. But I would need to have hundreds, if not thousands, of those kinds of conversations in order to really shift the outlooks of people who view transhumanism in a negative light and who have platforms that amplify that kind of messaging. Now, in terms of Mormon transhumanism, we've had a lot of successful engagements with Mormon transhumanists. Our virtual Enlightenment Salon with Carl Youngblood in January of 2022 is worth watching in this regard. And indeed, there are aspects of Mormon theology that are quite open to radical life extension and technological progress. It is interesting also, and I'd be curious as to your thoughts on this, whether certain backgrounds are significantly more conducive to an affinity toward transhumanism. And we mentioned Mormonism. There are also surprisingly high proportions of Russians or people from Russian-speaking countries and transhumanist communities, and there may be a strong influence of Russian cosmism for that. Aubrey de Grey has also identified 3 groups of people who tend to have an affinity toward transhumanism, and those are libertarians, IT professionals, and Canadians. So there is perhaps some interesting exploration to be done there. Are there other demographics that you've observed to either have an affinity toward transhumanism or perhaps to be less likely to embrace? And again, that's not a universal statement. It wouldn't be applicable to every individual. This would just be a statement of perhaps it's easier for people in those demographics to come to transhumanistic insights, whereas in other groups, they might have to do more work or would need to be more different from other members of that group to see the value in transhumanism.
Yes, definitely. I would say, in addition to IT workers, one of the things I noticed in the Cryonics survey is that there are a lot of people that might broadly be classified as engineers, not merely computer engineers, but let's say that engineers have a mindset and a professional training that basically is about problem solving and is about the idea that things are possible if you sort of focus on them enough. So while I think computer and software engineers are definitely the biggest chunk of these people, there are other fields of study, and perhaps especially biomedicine. I don't know that this is supported by the demographics of current transhumanists, but I do know that in biological medicine, anti-aging medicine, and some of these things that are very closely related to transhumanism have become more broadly acceptable. And I also think that, as many transhumanists themselves will point out, some of the advances in medicine are, like the advances in information technology, rather dramatic and have taken place within the lifetimes of people that are practicing those. So that while your average person may not be aware that anesthesia, open heart surgery, or even the use of paddles to sort of revive a person whose heart has stopped beating are all very recent phenomena, medical professionals do know this, and they are highly aware many times of the fact that what is possible even in the last 15 or 20 years is not possible, and that people's ideas of the hard limits of human experience and human life are just not the case, that the definition of death and these things themselves are very malleable and subject to not just digital, but biological, biomedical advances. So that's one thing that I would notice. I don't know how interested people are in this group or this audience by religious and cultural questions like this. But I think one of the things that Mormonism and, let's say, Orthodox theology, as well as what might be called Arminian, that's not Armenian like the country, but Arminian like the theology, all of these have in common a strong emphasis on, let's say, the cooperation of human and divine will that is called synergism in theology. This is where the term synergy in popular business culture came from originally, where we now talk about people synergizing their interests or their wills on a matter. This is a religious term, and different religious systems have felt very different about this. And Lutheranism and Calvinism, for instance, the idea is that God's will is what matters and human will is basically almost irrelevant. By contrast, Arminian theology and much Catholic theology, and certainly a lot of Orthodox theology, places a high emphasis on the role of human will cooperating to create the future, to create future states of being. And so I think if people were looking for an underlying religious explanation for why it is that there are so many Russian and Orthodox transhumanists, of course, cosmism is the clearest and most well-articulated and earliest example of something like transhumanism explicitly, but that it did not arise out of a vacuum. It does have to do also with revolutionary thought in the history of revolutionary thought. And I would mention as a side note here that the practice of blood exchange, of plasma exchange, predates Lenin and certain members of the eventual Politburo as an important idea in Russian thought. amongst scientists and amongst religious thinkers. There's also, for instance, a reason that I can't think of the name right now, the French Jesuit priest that created a form of transhumanism, an early form.
Teilhard de Chardin?
Yeah, Chardin, right. It's also not a mistake, not an accident that this person was Jesuit, because in Catholic theology, this is the same. Jesuit theology is Arminian. It basically thinks that you have to exercise the will. That's why the Jesuits have these spiritual exercises. On the other side are the Dominicans, for instance, who believe that human will is basically irrelevant. So if you're looking at religious transhumanisms, there's a reason that all these particular groups are especially prone to it, because their theologies already assume that human will has a role in creating a radically different future. And in general, you could say that many messianic religions traditionally have an image already of a radically different future. It's just a question of, is that something like transhumanism, and is there a role for people to play in it? So that's one thing. And then lastly, I guess I would say, in addition to fiction and all the things that we've talked about, different demographics, being drawn to transhumanism, I certainly do think that something like an interest in science fiction is there. But I just wanted to point once more to this idea that, regardless of whether or not you liked the Black Panther movies, this was in some ways the first popularization of Afrofuturism, that was really broadcast to a very large audience. And I do think that in terms of making people more amenable to transhumanism, sometimes it's something very personal in their own lives, and sometimes it's these broader cultural influences. And I do think that the more positive and diverse images of the future people have in mind, the more paths to transhumanism there are. And so I think it's overall a positive thing, like you say, that there is a very big tent approach, because not all people will come to this through the same path, but I think the fewer sort of prior assumptions you have to violate to get there, the smoother the path, certainly. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for that response. What we're trying to do in the Transhumanist Party is essentially make the paths of as many people as possible toward transhumanism as easy as possible by essentially identifying what those paths might be, what obstacles stand in the way, and removing those obstacles where possible, and hopefully with the many virtual Enlightenment salons that we've had, if people find that their path intersects with one or more of them, then they will see how some of those obstacles might be lifted. And you mentioned blood transfusions as well earlier in Russian history. One of the leading proponents of those approaches was Alexander Bogdanov, who used to be a prominent member of the Communist Party even before the Soviet Union was formed. He was essentially Lenin's rival for power. And after the Communist Revolution, he essentially founded an institute where he performed some of the experiments that he essentially outlined for fighting diseases and extending lifespans. Unfortunately, he died in the course of a blood transfusion where he tried to save the life of a student who had malaria and tuberculosis. And he actually did save the life of that student, but this was in 1928. And I think by doing the blood transfusion, he caught the diseases himself and perished from them, unfortunately. But yes, there was, especially in the early Soviet Union, a lot of this kind of cosmos thinking that was inspired by thinkers like Nikolai Fyodorov and Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Tsiolkovsky lived into the Soviet era until 1935, and he was able to also actually work on developing prototypes of some of his inventions, especially in the realm of rocketry. And he served as the inspiration for the Soviet space program subsequently as well. And a lot of this history is well known to Russian-speaking people because it was taught to some extent, of course, distorted through propaganda, but people know that this isn't just something completely fringe, that this existed in the past. And I would say the greater obstacles in that part of the world stem from a kind of fatalism about current conditions. A prevalent mindset is, well, things are falling apart now and the quality of life is bad now. And talking about a transhumanist future may be nice, but in the minds of those people, unattainable for those who are alive today. But they don't have the same kinds of moral objections that a lot of people in the West would. I will also point out it's interesting that you noted in your research that there's a negative correlation between being in an English-speaking country and embracing the term transhumanism, whereas people outside of the Anglophone world, for whatever reason, are more inclined to be receptive to that term. And that's kind of strange because a lot of transhumanist thinkers are concentrated in the English-speaking world too. I would be interested in more of your thoughts as to this particular disconnect and what influences do you think are behind it?
Sure. I think, the answer to this is in some ways, rather brief, which is that it is precisely the fact that while many aspects of transhumanism, essentially early transhumanism, are Russian in inspiration, both cosmism, parabiosis. Also, there are many aspects of early 20th century left-wing and communist thought that explicitly founded themselves on very techno-futuristic images of the future. Another great book that was written about this by James Scott called Seeing Like a State essentially looked at the relationship between US and Russian thought about the state, which are seen often as oppositional. But it took a long look at the way that in the middle of the 20th century, scientists looking at agriculture were explicitly in a lot of communication back and forth across this political divide. And it has some great images there of futuristic, almost solar punking seeming images of agriculture in the future. And it's like, is this Russian? Is this American? You almost can't tell because there was a certain optimism amongst those people about what was possible about the future. But I think essentially because the weight of transhumanism shifted by the middle of the 20th century to the English-speaking world, that is simply where the baggage is. Transhumanism means things and has a greater social impact in the English-speaking world. And therefore, the kind of thing that you were referring to earlier, Gennady, about this idea about the World Economic Forum, and in particular, its founder wrote a book on the Fourth Industrial Revolution that talks about convergence in a way that I think many transhumanists might talk about the singularity, about the convergence of the biological and the digital. And these are the two, I think, main influences. That on the one hand, transhumanism, explicit transhumanism, has a longer history or a more, let's say, continuous history in the English-speaking world that gives the opportunity for more negative baggage. And secondarily, that in this same part of the world, the people that are seen as the, like Klaus Schwab, the proponents of a sort of popularized transhumanism, and not just popularized, but an elite level transhumanism with organizations like the World Economic Forum and the Young Global Leaders, that where a lot of current heads of state, like Macron in France and Obama and various people, were members of these organizations. It allows for people that are very skeptical about this kind of thing of transhumanism, it gives them a real specific purchase about the idea that the elites in these countries are in favor of something like transhumanism. So that discourse is a little stronger. And for whatever reason, it's not just in English. I did this image search using the Portuguese and Spanish terms of transhumanism, for example. And this particular term, when you look it up, still has this sort of not still, has developed a very negative connotation in people's minds around what they see as a sort of globalist conspiracy to create a certain kind of world. And I would say, lastly, there is something about climate collapse or climate crisis, however you want to talk about it, that is also a bit at stake and dates back to ideas that were very popular in the English-speaking world. Essentially, that is overpopulation, which I think is highly dubious. And also the idea that elites in these parts of the world wanted to essentially eliminate most people to produce a greener future. So there's this weird idea. It may seem weird, I guess, to a lot of transhumanists, but I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole because I'm not promoting these ideas. I just want to be clear. I'm just saying that there's an idea here that, especially in the English-speaking world, that the elites in many of these countries want to create a transhumanist future that essentially gets rid of most of the present world's population and brings it down to like the number that's thrown out is like under 500 million, and therefore sees a lot of things that are happening in the world as intentional plans to reduce the human population. And so that is, I would say, a part of it that I haven't mentioned so far. But when you do these image searches and you try to go deep into the heart of what people are meaning when they talk about transhumanism online, not transhumanists themselves, but non-transhumanists, this is a bit of the fear. And I don't want to say this is more popular in the English-speaking world. I think it mostly has to do with the fact that transhumanism as a label just has a longer history and a more continuous history in the English-speaking world. But I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention and try to contextualize for people where this negativity comes from and what it looks like, you know.
Yes, indeed. And the strange aspect of this is we often get a criticism mostly from the left, like the neo-Malthusian left, saying, well, won't radical life extension lead to overpopulation? And this criticism is sometimes innocently echoed by people who have largely been steeped in the zeitgeist of the 1960s and the 1970s and have been repeating talking points from people like Paul Ehrlich, for instance, and they too are worried about overpopulation. They see rapid population growth. And then there's this other criticism from what I would broadly characterize as the alt-right, saying transhumanists want to reduce the human population. And this just seems to be a completely inconsistent set of criticisms. Of course, transhumanists have often countered the overpopulation argument by specifically stating we do not have an overpopulation problem right now. Even if human populations were to dramatically increase, there would be sufficient resources, especially with human ingenuity being amplified by having more minds in existence. But also, transhumanists encourage additional technologies that would greatly open up any resource constraints that we have. And for individuals, we see it as a moral priority to extend people's lifespans, not shorten their lives, not take them out of existence. So I am not sure how any person can legitimately think that transhumanists are trying to reduce the overall human population, given our emphasis on radical life extension. And so this has kind of come as a surprise to me because I have, for a much longer period of time, been exposed to the neo-Malthusian arguments about how overpopulation is bad and transhumanism would contribute to more population. So I would just put it out to the critics of transhumanism. Which is it? Which way do you want to attack us? Pick one, and then we'll engage with you on it. Because right now, we are receiving some mutually inconsistent attacks here. But I think your point is well taken. Somehow, a sizable number of people have been led to believe this myth about transhumanism. So now I want to open this up to additional questions from our panel, and let's start with Art Ramon Garcia for his question.
Yeah, I've been involved with transhumanism since, at least with the party since like 2020. And, as an artist, I always had the motto, art has the power to change the world. And I was wondering, how can I actually make that happen, at myself as an artist? And, finally it came to me last year is to create a children's book on transhumanism. So I did that, had the idea, say, in probably October, started working on it in November, and had it done by the 14th. And I actually said, transhumanist, and I wanted to use the T word. So I used 2 capital T words for transhumanist, just so that there wasn't any vagueness on it. So yeah, this is on Amazon. I do have, this is bilingual book, English, Spanish, and yeah, what prompted me to create this was some guy I was listening to on TikTok, and supposedly he was saying that some engineers had approached him and were saying how Hispanics were falling behind, and that there needed to be some sort of children's book, kind of help Hispanics, reach for the stars, rather than just reading children's books on, making tamales with abuelita, So that's kind of what I did. Is I created this Reaching for the Stars children's book, and I also made it about transhumanism. So if anyone who's looked at my book, you see I've got a lot of transhumanist themes throughout the book, interweaved ideas I've had for years, just kind of floated around in my head. And yeah, somehow I managed to cobble it together and create a narrative. And you probably haven't seen any research because I just printed it as an ebook on the 14th of last December. So yeah, and I did have a question, and it's about Afrofuturism. And we've had guests on here from Africa, and I mentioned to that, it's like, why isn't there any Afrofuturism in Africa? Why is it always American Afrofuturism from Stan Lee? And I think that's what's kind of missing in Africa, is they need to build their own Afrofuturism there. And this book I have here, I've already translated it into 6 African languages as an ebook. So it's out there as an African ebook. And I just need transhumanists in Africa to buy it and, give it to a school or lend it out. And it'd be part of their sort of strategy to engage with the community. You lend out the book, you have the family read it, you go back and you talk to the family. So it's a vital tool, say, rather than handing out just a flyer about transhumanism, because it's a very engaging book, which, at a later date, you can go retrieve and actually talk to somebody one-on-one. So, and so I want to hear more about your Afrofuturism ideas. I mean, have you considered Afrofuturism?
That's a great question and very perceptive, I think, because it is true that a lot of Afrofuturism is essentially U.S. or New World, let's say, an origin or an orientation. And I included a link here in the chat that basically defines African futurism, which is an alternative later term that was offered by Nnedi Wahala. Also, African futurist authors like Okorafor that are well known, that have tried to grapple with this exact question, basically saying, all right, look, I mean, no disrespect to the African diaspora. That's definitely never the intention of African futurism either. But there is a way in which Afrofuturism has assumed or taken for granted the Black American experience rather than the wider diaspora or the specifically African experience. So there have been people that have tried to correct for this, I think. And it may just be, I think, the result a little bit of history and the places where these science fiction writers who focused on this were located. One of the things I really enjoyed was the Xenogenesis series. which just to give you, I'll see if I can give you a quick link here. But Octavia Butler is the key author here. I think it is partly a result of history that a lot of Black futurisms, let's say, were essentially Afrofuturisms that originated in the U.S. And a lot of people, African authors, science fiction writers, and let's say speculative fiction writers more broadly, have tried to correct this. So I do think your point is very well taken. There's a way in which a lot of Afrofuturism is not specifically focused on Africa in this way. But I think in many ways, the examples of African futurism that have arisen are, if anything, more, I want to say more hopeful. I wouldn't say more hopeful. I would say something like less constrained by the dominant narratives about the future that exist in the English-speaking world. Because as Gennady and other people here have pointed out, there are a number of strains of pessimism about the future in the English-speaking world that may not exist everywhere. And so I think, if anything, the broadening of Afrofuturism or African futurism has developed in ways that may be helpful to transhumanism to think about and dialogue with. I've also seen a little bit, likewise, I referred to solar punk earlier, and this doesn't have any ethnic or component really necessarily. But I do think this is something you see in Afrofuturism as well. There is the vision of the future, I don't want to say is less sterile, because I don't think that intentionally, like, positive images of the future are intentionally sterile. But there is let's say, a more biological element of this. In the Octavia Butler series, Xenogenesis, she's better known for the parable of the sower, or I'm trying to think of other works that are really well known of hers. But Xenogenesis is a great example of a more optimistic view of the future, of expanding and making contact with other life forms, other sentient beings, in a less dystopian way. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from those, because these anxieties and concerns that people more broadly have, even, let's just say, white people in the West, or whatever, these anxieties about the future come from a particular cultural background. And in many ways, adding these different voices that don't assume that a highly technologically advanced future is therefore replacing nature or is necessarily replacing cultural diversity, creates a greater sense of ease. And that's certainly what I focused on in my first article, a greater sense of ease about the future and the possibilities of technological development. So I just want to echo what you're saying here, which is that in some ways, it may even be that Afrofuturism is too limiting in the sense of where it comes from. But I don't think it's too limiting in the sense that it and other responses to it are views that correct some of the misunderstandings about what transhumanists want and the kinds of futures that they're interested in, by incorporating these other elements of human experience, religion, spirituality, religious, racial, ethnic, and cultural difference, and the incorporation of natural elements into highly technological futures, I think.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that response. And indeed, it is our hope that Afrofuturism and African futurism will become more prominent in the coming years. I think if one looks at which parts of the world is the population still growing in the fastest, one will find the African continent to be among them. And it will be particularly interesting because as Western countries do experience stagnating or declining populations, at least until we get radical life extension, immigration is going to be a necessary component of the solution there. And we're going to have more people from the African continent coming and also interacting with what you call the African diaspora and creating, let's say, amalgamated visions of the future as well. which will also interact with the broader visions of the future found in the countries that they move to. So it's going to be, I would say, this kind of hyperpluralism that we mentioned previously, where there will be attempts to create these culturally specific futurisms, but they're also going to interact with other futurisms as well, and sometimes combine in interesting ways. And we're going to see this within the next few decades, perhaps even sooner, in some fascinating ways. I think ways we can't even readily anticipate from our standpoint, but I do think that a lot of the future of humanity in the 21st and certainly the 22nd century is going to originate from the African continent. Just demographically, that is going to be quite probable. And we are already seeing some people from the African continent, particularly from an organization called Afro Longevity. And many of the same people have worked with Taft's, the transdisciplinary agora for future discussions, that have been quite transhumanist in their outlook. And we hope that we will continue our communications and exchanges with them as well. But I also, in the last 3 minutes or so of our salon, wanted to give Ben Ballweg the opportunity to ask a question.
Thanks for coming, William. Just wanted to see kind of how you got interested in transhumanism, where that all sprung from, that you decided this is the career for me.
Yes, well, this is not my first research project. So transhumanism was not the only research interest that I've had, but I would say anthropology in the United States is the broader study of humans. It's not just cultural anthropology, what we think of in terms of going to places, studying different societies and seeing how they lived. It's also the study of human evolution, of biological anthropology. And so the combination of those two things, of an interest in all the diversity and depth of human history and the many radical changes that we've already undergone, and also the sense that you get from archaeology and biological anthropology, that humans are essentially defined by their relationship to technology in some ways, are both sort of key things that helped inform my particular perspective and my interest in transhumanism, because essentially tracing the development of humans is in some ways tracing the development of their technologies. And so you sort of have this perspective as an anthropologist that not all social scientists may have. I would also say that maybe like many of you, I am concerned with the lack of positive future visions in contemporary political and cultural settings. This is something that I think you could say is true maybe on the left and the right. I certainly know the situation a little bit better on the left, perhaps. But there is certainly a way in which the image of the future, if you look at, for instance, these Soviet views or mid-20th century views about the future, there were a lot of positive images that people were creating a positive future. And now, I think if you look perhaps at the contemporary left and the right to some extent, the image is that, the future and technology are essentially scary. The best we can do is to stop the development of some of these advancements so that we can survive. And I think that, while there is certainly wisdom to wanting to be careful about the way that we implement future technologies and deciding what the best uses of them are, it is a bit poisonous and dangerous to only have negative views of the future. And I think that that's something that I've always tried in my research and in my prior projects to try to correct for. I've tended to focus on, I don't want to say hopeful, but people who have images of the future where they can imagine advancement and progress, because I think that's contrary to a lot of popular culture and its ideas about the future. So I guess that's the shortest answer, that there are some disciplinary underpinnings about the role of technology in defining humanity and all the many ways that humans can live with technology in different settings. but also this sense of contemporary culture where I do feel like images of the future have gotten darker in some ways, and that this is potentially a very big motivational problem for people. So I guess those are the two main elements for me.
Yes, and thank you very much, Will, for your work. It injects a much needed dose of hopefulness. I know you mentioned that a bit, but also realism in the sense of what is possible, what we can do with our own efforts to improve our lives and the situation of humanity, just as improvements have been achieved throughout our history. And we are thankful that you were able to join us for our salon today. As Alan pointed out, this has gone by way too fast, lots of good content. And I hope that you continue in your excellent endeavors and that we all live long and prosper.